Continuation of Chapter 4. Disastrous Consequences of Masonic Principles. After having defined the principles of Freemasonry, Leo XIII comes to the consequences they engender. The results are utterly deplorable. Public immorality. Quote, "For wherever, by removing Christian education, the sect has begun more completely to rule, their goodness and integrity of morals have begun quickly to perish. Monstrous and shameful opinions have grown up, and the audacity of evil deeds has risen to a high degree. All this is commonly complained of and deplored, and not a few of those who by no means wish to do so are compelled by abundant evidence to give not infrequently the same testimony." End quote. In reading this passage, one might believe that Leo XIII was writing in our day, speaking of the audacity of evil deeds that the newspapers daily report. Kidnappings, crimes, assassinations in France and Spain and elsewhere, the bombs that go off, killing the innocent. It is atrocious. The audacity of evil deeds is truly the spectacle we are met with. Then the Pope alludes to the negation of original sin, the cause of all these disorders. Negation of original sin and the consumer society. Quote, "Moreover, human nature was stained by original sin, and is therefore more disposed to vice than to virtue. For a virtuous life, it is absolutely necessary to restrain the disorderly movements of the soul, and to make the passions obedient to reason. In this conflict, human beings must very often be despised, and the greatest labors and hardships must be undergone, in order that reason may also hold its sway. Both the naturalists and Freemasons, having no faith in those things which we have learned by the revelation of God, deny that our first parents sinned, and consequently think that free will is not at all weakened and inclined to evil. On the contrary, exaggerating rather our natural virtue and excellence, and placing therein alone the principle and rule of justice, they cannot even imagine that there is any need at all of a constant struggle and a perfect steadfastness to overcome the violence and rule of our passions. Wherefore we see that men are publicly tempted by the many allurements of pleasure, that there are journals and pamphlets with neither moderation nor shame, that stage plays are remarkable for license, that designs for works of art are shamelessly sought in the laws of a so-called realism, that the contrivances of a soft and delicate life are most carefully devised, and that all the blandishments of pleasure are diligently sought out, by which virtue may be lulled to sleep." End quote. So, man finds himself subject to the slavery of passion to all that is afforded by the so-called consumer society. How else can the consumer society be described than by the will to put as many material goods as possible at the disposition of men, and then to urge them to pursue pleasure, money, gain, and goods? If it were only a question of placing useful and honorable goods at men's disposition, that would be tolerable. But evil and indecent goods are put on a par with the good. Ultimately, everything is done to encourage sin. Let us not be surprised to see society on the way to suicide, heading towards its own annihilation. Original sin, virtue, the immaterial nature of the soul, the spiritual element that must prevail over the material, all are discounted. Man is but a body made to consume. He must be incited to consume as much as possible so as to earn as much money as possible, and he must be given all the means that lead to sin. Communist enslavement. When the communists come to power, however, the people no longer receive the superfluities of the consumer society, as this all goes to the rulers. Man becomes just a slave, a tool for work for the state, and who must eat just what is necessary to keep body and soul together so as to go on working. All the rest must go to the state, to serve the devil, Freemasonry, communism, to serve the world revolution and the destruction of the church. For men in the consumer society, the slavery of the passions holds sway, which may seem less serious than the slavery to which are reduced the peoples subject to communism, but in a certain sense, the slavery of the passions is more detrimental to the life of the soul and faith and the conservation of religion than is the slavery of communism. By depriving men of all the goods that are offered by the consumer society, the communist slavery puts them in a state of penance, of mortification, and in this condition men are led to think more and to seek the goods of the spirit. This explains why religion is perhaps more alive and keen behind the Iron Curtain than in the West. For there is no surer way to sink souls in the enjoyment of pleasures and bring an end to religion than by satisfying all the passions of men. It is undoubtedly easier for the Freemasons to try and wrest men from the hold of religion in this pleasure-seeking society than for the communists to do as much to the peoples who have been deprived of these goods and forced to work like slaves. For if indeed the people of these lands suffer from the brutalized condition in which they are held, one notices that, deprived of the goods of this world, they turn more readily towards the goods of the soul. Whence the tenacious battle the communists wage against religion, so that it gain no advantage from the mortified state in which communism has put them. In all the schools whence God has been banished, the professors of atheism still relentlessly pursue the war against religion. Destruction of the family by the destruction of marriage. After having studied the principles of Masonry and the deplorable results that ensue when they are supplied to the spiritual life, private morals, and even politics, and after having denounced the criminality and the slavery of completely unbridled passions, Leo XIII broaches the subject of the destruction of the family. Quote, "Generally, no one is accustomed to obey crafty and clever men so submissively as those whose soul is weakened and broken down by the domination of the passions. There have been in the sect of the Freemasons some who have plainly determined and proposed that, artfully and of set purpose, the multitude should be satiated with a boundless license of vice, as, when this had been done, it would easily come under their power and authority for any acts of daring." End quote. To develop the systematic corruption of the populace is, for the Freemasons, one of the most effective ways to bring about the destruction of the family. Quote, "What refers to domestic life in the teaching of the naturalists is almost all contained in the following declarations: that marriage belongs to the genus of commercial contracts, which can be rightly revoked by the will of those who made them." End quote. In principle, every contract can be revoked. There is no reason why a contract cannot be dissolved if those who have concluded it decide to break it. Because it was made by the will of the contracting parties, they can also terminate it. If this reasoning applies to free acts, depending solely upon the will of the contracting parties, this is so. While marriage is truly a contract, nonetheless it is only free as concerns the choice of persons, but not as to the conditions according to which it is concluded. The conditions of the contract have been inscribed in the very nature of man and woman. It is God Himself who placed the conditions of the contract in nature itself. Men are not obliged to enter the contract, but as soon as they have, they can no longer dissolve it, because the conditions in which it was established manifest that it cannot be broken. This contract is binding until the death of the spouses. The family is made for procreation, for increasing the human race. Thus, the parents cannot break at their good pleasure this contract, as such a separation would leave the children abandoned. This is what we have seen ever since the legalization of divorce. This is why the Church has always taught the indissolubility of marriage. The bond cannot be broken. In extreme cases, the Church tolerates the separation of bodies, but she never admits divorce. In certain cases, she recognizes the nullity of a marriage, but this can only be for certain reasons. When the Church recognizes the nullity of a marriage, it is because she has discovered that one of the conditions of the contract has not been fulfilled. For example, because there was the presence of fear or threat. The woman was married under the pressure of her parents, under threat of harm, and so felt such fear that she dared not say no. Without this constraint, she would have said no. If truly one can discover that before the contract there was imposed moral pressure, such that the will was not free, the contract did not take place, for it lacked the liberty of one of the parties. This is one of the reasons that can be invoked.